In this video, I am going to talk about Nazism, because who doesn't like a good conversation about Nazis? Welcome back to the channel. For those who have been on here for a while, you might recall that about a year ago, I did a video on communism. And this was following a commentator who accused me of being a communist, which is quite hilarious, really. So in the spirit of a little bit of entertainment and digging into things, I thought, for contrast, we should do Nazis. And what triggered this was the current row about Gary Linekar and his commentary, in which he is comparing the communication done by the Conservative Party as somewhat reminiscent of 1930s Nazi Germany. And I shall come back onto that in a bit. Now, people might be asking why, as a negotiator running this negotiation channel, do I want to talk about Nazism, do I want to talk about racism, and so on. Now, first reason is politics. I'm interested in politics. I enjoy talking about it. Second reason is that I am an international negotiator. And understanding political bias and allegiance and racism is actually crucial to being a successful negotiator. I'll let you into a little secret. If a negotiator turns up with a strong bias in any particular direction, whether that be left or right, or whether they're racist or whatever it may be, that doesn't give them strength. That makes them vulnerable to a professional negotiator like me. That is because their bias creates weaknesses, and those weaknesses can be exploited. So this is why I talk about and I teach about cultural issues and racism, so on, not just because I'm interested in the topic, but because understanding and delving into this topic is a key skill that I require and that I teach my students in order to make them better negotiators. So for anyone new to this channel, I am a professional negotiator of well over 10 years of experience. I like to use this channel to talk about negotiation issues, but in this particular video I am just going to focus more specifically on the topic of racism, and this is going to be set in the context, nice and timely, of the row of the BBC suspending Gary Linekar for his tweet about the Conservative Party. So let's start by talking about the BBC, because a lot of noise has been made about BBC impartiality rules, but really this has been called out quite significantly by those in the media, those in journalism and so on, as being somewhat of a fallacy. So I shan't go too much into this because this is covered in depth all across the internet and YouTube, but very briefly, it's very difficult to be truly impartial on any political issue or a wide range of political issues in the current climate. The current political culture, especially in a sort of adversarial first-past the post political system, does not encourage much in the way of impartiality. It tries to gear people towards being one side of a fence or another. So being impartial is a very difficult juggling act for the BBC, even in the best of times. Looking into more recent years and how the BBC has been covering things, serious questions can be raised about how successful they are at being impartial. Because the honest truth is that people have been saying that their bias is very obvious in their coverage. So what's an example of this? Well, let's talk economic matters, because I have an interest in that as well. Every time the BBC brings an expert to talk about economics or to explain some kind of financial crisis or whatever, and we've seen a lot of that recently, the only people the BBC call upon are on the right side of the political spectrum. Quite often, those individuals belong to interesting think tanks with vague or opaque sources of funding, but what they do all have in common is that they all fit into very specific categories of economic thinking. It'd be a bit too blunt to say, but they are basically right-wing in their economic outlook. The BBC never, almost never, invites left-wing economists to counterbalance that viewpoint. They just invite different right-wing economists. So that's hardly what you might call, being particularly neutral. But worse than that, because of the way that the BBC opens up segments, they will have things that are default or accepted presumptions. So one real clear example of that is that they've fallen into the political trap of repeating the narrative that's put forward by certain economists or by politicians that the economy works in the same way as a household budget or credit card. And any credible or competent economist will tell you that is not the case. It is far more complicated than that. But the BBC has gone for this need to try and simplify economics, because it's not always straightforward or simple. But they've done so in a way that is biased in terms of the political framing. So really, and that is replicated across the board, across different programs. Now, unlike many other media outlets, they do at least allow difference in views. So you do get more of a spectrum than you would particularly with the newspapers or GB News as a counter example. But I talk about a lot of frames of reference in negotiations. And let's just pick on immigration, because that is going to be a topic in this video, as a clear example. You can be a white middle-class individual living in a very white middle-class type of town, having never even seen, or barely ever even seen, an immigrant in your town. But if the BBC runs daily reports of immigrants crossing the channel in small boats, or stories of immigrants committing crimes, or stories of immigrants causing disruption in whatever form, then you, as that white middle-class type voter in that town, could have the belief that immigrants are causing crime, they're causing problems and so on, having never ever even seen it or directly experienced it, and possibly living in complete ignorance of the fact that those particular stories could be congregated in very small areas and could be statistically insignificant when compared to, for example, white crime or black crime or whatever it is, native UK crime. The point is, people's views can be distorted by what is environmental or ecological factors. So in other words, what is happening around them, what is their perception of what is happening around them. And here's where the BBC's whole concept of impartiality really falls flat. Because unless you statistically balance viewpoints as well as politically balance viewpoints, you cannot be impartial. So maybe you've got to have more news stories to counterbalance the negative stories. Maybe you've got to have more coverage of white people committing crimes or crossing boats or doing stupid things, whatever it may be, in order to create that balanced context in which you set the news reporting. And the BBC has failed in that quite significantly. Because of course, they're chasing whatever are the news headlines of the day. But the news headlines of the day are quite often set by politicians and quite often set by the print media, which is not necessarily reflective of what is happening in the wider world or in the UK. And it's always important to bear this in mind, because for those who really understand these dark arts, a lot of money and a lot of effort is put into altering people's perceptions. Some might call that marketing. Some might call that brainwashing or political propaganda. Whatever the term you want to use, it is a thing. It happened. It is how people are influenced. And the BBC, as a prime broadcaster, is in a significant position to influence how people think and how people perceive their environment. Moving on a little bit from that topic, and I'm going to talk about the politically compromised individuals currently at the BBC. It is no secret whatsoever that there's quite a few people at the top of the BBC who are strong Conservative Party supporters. They been appointed by the Conservative Party. They have been members of the Conservative Party. They've made significant political donations to the Conservative Party, and in the case of the chair of the BBC, even arranged an £800,000 loan for the Prime Minister prior to being offered the appointment as chair of the BBC. So nothing controversial there whatsoever, obviously. So needless to say, if you have a whole bunch of people at the top of any organisation and they all happen to believe in something so much that they're willing to put their hard-earned money into it, they automatically come with political allegiance and political bias. That is not impartial. An impartial person is perhaps someone a little bit more like me, who does not associate themselves with a political party. That's a deliberate thing. I do that deliberately. I try to be objective. So the idea that the BBC is impartial or politically neutral when so many heads of the organisation are quite simply not, it's just laughable, quite frankly. There's no way they can be objectable. So they can be objective. I shouldn't say objectionable, though that as well. And there are horror stories as well that those politically compromised individuals are altering BBC output. They're making decisions. They say, no, that's too left-wing, for example. We don't want that shown. This was reported as having happened to a David Attenborough show. And they are also interfering in the hiring of people. So the chair of the BBC has insisted that he is involved on interviewing candidates, which is something no previous chair has done. And that alone should also send alarm bells that the integrity of the BBC as an impartial organisation is being severely compromised by those individuals. So as a result of all this, we can see that the BBC does actually have a clear bias in their reporting. So for them to have a go at Gary Linekar for offering up criticism, needless to say, is somewhat hypocritical. But worse than that is that the whole point of being impartial as an organisation is that you need to be able to criticise both sides. And what is really becoming clear, and increasingly so over recent years, is that the BBC has become incredibly shy about criticising the ruling government, current ministers, current policies, and so on. And if they're not doing that, then they're not doing their job. They're not holding power to account. And they should be doing so to the Labour leadership as well as the Conservative leadership. And it is becoming abundantly clear that they are not. And if they're not doing that, if they're not criticising both ways, then they are not impartial. So going back to the topic of Gary Linekar tweeting that the way the Conservative Party communicates about asylum seekers and refugees is reminiscent of 1930s Nazi Germany. Well, we have to, of course, ask ourselves the question of what is the Conservative Party really, in order to benchmark, Gary's claims. Now, I'm not going to be too controversial here, but I am going to offer up my conclusions first and then explain how I reached those conclusions and why they matter. What is their significance in the context of this conversation? So looking at the question, what is the Conservative Party really? Well, let's take a couple, and particularly in the context of immigration and refugees, let's take some of the two noisiest people that they have. Let's take Suella Braverman and Lee Anderson. They're not the only ones, but they're just the most visible examples, so I'm going to use them in that context. Suella Braverman and Lee Anderson are incredibly racist individuals. In fact, they are so racist that if they were any more racist, they would be neo-Nazis, just without the anti-Semitism. I said I wouldn't be too controversial. Let me explain that. Now, those individuals, people who know them might say that on a personal level, they're not racist. And that's possible. That's quite credible. They could be putting on an act for the TV, for the politics. That is entirely possible. But my argument here is that when you're in a leadership role, you are what you preach, you are how you act. You cannot be racist to one group of people and not racist to another group of people and say you're not racist. It doesn't work that way. So if we look at the language used by those individuals and by the modern day Conservative Party as a whole, when they talk about asylum seeking, immigration and so on, that language is inflammatory, it is derogatory, it is dangerous, it is not at all nuanced, it is overly simplistic, and in short, it is designed specifically to create negative connotations against asylum seekers who, by unfortunate coincidence, happen to be brown or black skinned. Because of course this negative language is not used against Ukrainian refugee seekers, for example. So we have to look at their language, and we have to judge them by their actions and their words. And in brutal honesty, it is not good, and it reflects extremely badly on the Conservative Party. But we need to go a bit further than that, because I used the word neo-Nazi earlier, and this is the association that is also being made by the comments being made by Gary Linekar. He hasn't himself called them neo-Nazi. I've done that, and so has the print media made that association. But the implications are very much there. And of course there is a rule that whenever anyone shouts out Nazi, then they discredit themselves automatically, because quite often that term is used in a rather hyperbolic sense. But I want to dig into this a little further, and I want to highlight why this matters in this context. So let's have a look at what are some of the defining characteristics of Nazism. And I'm not going to do a whole in-depth analysis thing here, that'd be a very boring video. I am just focusing on what I consider are the bits relevant in the context of the asylum seekers debate. Now, one of the mistakes that people make when they think about a political construct like Nazism is that they tend to associate it with some of the more high-profile things. So in the case of Nazism, anti-Semitism. And anyone who says, for example, that Suella Braverman is anti-Semitic is going down a silly rabbit hole. As I understand it, she is married to a Jewish husband, and actually I've seen no evidence at all of any comments from her to indicate that she is anti-Semitic. And so some people may think, well, she's not anti-Semitic, then there's no way she can be a Nazi or a neo-Nazi. Well, that is not true. And the reason why is that the Nazis weren't just anti-Semitic. So one of the defining characteristics of the Nazis is that they were very much used aggressive language against a whole host of minorities. In 1930s Germany, you had a truly miserable time if you were Jewish. No doubt about that whatsoever. However, they weren't the only people picked upon by the Nazis. If you were gay, if you were disabled or with deformity, if you were black, if you were brown, if you were a gypsy, then you were equally in line for some pretty bad treatment by the Nazis and those who supported them or bought into their ideology. And it should not be forgotten that those minorities themselves also died in the gas chambers along with the Jews. They also went to the concentration camps. Now there's quite a bit of still a lively debate about why this was the case. Why did the Nazis pick upon, Jews and other minorities? Did they truly believe it? Did they truly just hate them as a group of people? And when talking about the disabled and deformed, that does fit into some of their almost religious ideology. That is true. But other historians have also argued that the context was also political, that the Nazis were able to exploit people's fear or distrust of other cultures, other people with different skin colour who they did not understand. And back in the 1930s, and not just in Germany, it was pretty much an across the Western world phenomenon, it was okay to be racist. That was the cultural norm at the time. The difference is that the Nazis took the "it is okay to be racist" and industrialized it. They made it a powerful political tool which they could use to drive forward their agenda, to create a form of identity, to create us and them division. That is what they did. So in the context of talking about refugees, for example, if any politician is doing so for political gain, then they are basically playing, copying the Nazi handbook on this. And this is an old trick. This has been done for, a very, very long time by political parties and politicians of, across the board in various countries. This is not a new phenomenon. So when we look at the language of the Conservative Party and why they are talking so negatively about asylum seekers, it is very hard not to tick this box that they are doing so for political reasons. They want to prosecute a cultural war. Because the absolute truth is that if the Conservative government wanted to stop small boats, they could do so. Very quickly, very easily. You grab all the asylum seekers, you process them, you put them on the Eurostar into the UK, you then funnel them into appropriate accommodation. There wouldn't be any small boats at that point. There wouldn't be any need to. There's a whole host of things they could do. And they could still prosecute some of their, anti-immigration rhetoric and deport them and all the other bits and pieces. But the thing is, they could actually do that effectively if they wanted to stop small boats. They have not done so because really you can only argue they don't want to stop the small boats. So this is very much a manufactured crisis. And it's a manufactured crisis that is now wrapped around political rhetoric, political language that's extremely aggressive and extremely disturbing in its content and the way that it demeans those who are getting into those small boats. Whatever anyone's views about immigration, no one should be happy about that kind of language being used and that kind of crisis being continued for political gain. So a strong argument can be made here that Suella Braverman and Lee Anderson, the Conservative Party at large, are doing so for political reasons, political gain, and in this case they're copying the Nazi handbook. So let's look at the next bit. Misinformation propaganda. Well, lots have been talk about this, that we live in a post-truth world. And you look at anything that Conservative ministers and parties are saying, and there is so much misinformation, it's ridiculous. There is so much spinning and trying to paint things in a different light that we are clearly entering this environment. This was a clear characteristic of the Nazi Party in the 1930s, spearheaded by Joseph Goebbels. He was very much a master of this. This was his stock in trade. This was how he supported the aims of the Nazi Party, by persuading people that, what they believed was wrong, they should believe something else. And the Conservative Party are very much doing this as well. And that is objectively easy to track and to see, and also quite disturbing. And the problem is, they're doing this and they're creating a conversation about asylum seekers because they do not want to talk about anything else. They don't want to talk about their economic performance, the state of the NHS, the state of the economy, the state of law and order. These all should be, or some of them at least, their political strong points. But they can't talk about those because they're all failures at this point in time. So they must turn what is actual failure and pretend they're successes, and then divert the conversation onto a different topic that generates stronger emotions. And the topic they have chosen is asylum seekers, and they're using misinformation as part of that purpose. So again, another tick in the box that would indicate they're behaving like the Nazis did back in the 1930s. So the next one to look at is the issue of relocation policy. Now there's a whole host of other policy things that I could go into, but I'm just talking about immigration and asylum seekers here, and so I'm going to focus something very specific and narrow. Back in the 1930s, the Nazis came up with what's called the Madagascar Plan. This was before war broke out, and this is when they were still on speaking terms with the French. Now, admittedly, there are quite a few key differences, but what the basic premise of that plan is that they would take all the undesirables, Jewish, Gypsy, whatever, and they would ship them all to Madagascar. They would those people would then form their own self-governing colony, if you like, on Madagascar, under the overall supervision of a Nazi German sort of governor, if you like. And this will sort of build up as a bit of a sort of a humane way of dealing with the problem. Of course, we all know the history. We all know they gave up on that idea as completely unworkable and went to what will later be known as the final solution, because all the other options had failed. So if you dig into that particular plan, and I'll try and post a link to a bit of description, in the video description below for anyone else who wants to have a look at that. And then if you compare that to the Rwanda policy, you might start to see some pretty disturbing similarities. Possibly the one difference is that the Conservative Party are not proposing to grab UK people, confiscate all their assets and then send them abroad. Oh, oops, they are. That is when they're denying people modern day slavery protection. That is exactly what they're doing, and that looked again eerily similar to the Madagascar Plan. So the whole Rwanda policy, the whole anyone found to have come over here by regular means will just lose everything and be sent to a third country where anything could happen to them. Yeah, this is another policy incredibly reminiscent of 1930s Nazi policy. And then I'm going to come to the final and the worst bit of all this, at least in my view. Because one of the other defining characteristics of the Nazis, well, actually no, I missed a bit, didn't I? Populism. Of course, how could I miss populism? The Nazis promoted a whole host of populist policies. So their ill treatment of the Jews in particular allowed them to do other things that benefited them. So, for example, they created vacancies in the job market that could be filled by native German workers. So, and they pursued policies of full employment, full production, increased national pride, etc. How that links in to the Conservative treatment of asylum seekers is not so clear. But what is clear is that Conservatives themselves are pushing forward populist agendas that do not have genuine benefit to the UK. Or at least may have short-term benefit, but long-term costs and consequences that are negative. So worth highlighting that as another issue. And now for the worst one of all, the one that really, really bugs me. You see, the Nazis didn't care about human life. They didn't care about laws, international conventions, and so on. Doesn't that sound a bit familiar? And so we're entering into a territory where the likes of Suella Braverman and Lee Anderson are openly admitting that they're very happy to completely change UK laws or not to adhere to international laws and conventions. And when somebody, particularly a politician, particularly someone in power, enters into that territory where the rule of law does not matter, you are truly entering a dark space. And it cannot be overemphasized just how sinister this is. And again, this is very reminiscent of 1930s Nazi. When the Conservative Party talk about the UK pulling out of the European Convention of Human Rights, you need to understand, everybody needs to understand, that that convention only minimally applies to refugees and asylum seekers. It primarily applies to citizens in a country. So when they're using the whole issue of asylum seekers and lefty lawyers and so on as justification, what they're proposing is not really to reduce refugee rights, because they can do that with the illegal migration bill anyway. What they're proposing, or if they can ever get that passed, what they're proposing is to take away the rights from everybody else. And the Nazis did that. And the Nazis dressed it up as anti-Jewish policies and all that sort of thing. And the Nazis demonized anybody who challenged their flouting of national and international laws. In fact, there are even some famous German lawyers who took the Nazi parties to court and won various cases. Those lawyers were later quietly executed by the Nazis, having been demonized by them throughout. Doesn't that sound familiar? Lefty lawyers, human rights lawyers who don't care about the issue? Doesn't that sound awfully similar to what is going on right now, especially when that commentary is levied against laws that are unworkable and illegal? So perhaps to end a particular slide, it would be hyperbolic to call the Conservative Party Nazis or neo-Nazis. But it is far from hyperbolic to say that they seem to be copying the Nazi playbook on how to do this sort of thing. So Gary Linekar is on a fundamentally level is right. What they do is very reminiscent, is very similar. And he highlights that particular period in history, not because it hasn't happened in other contexts, other countries, other time periods, but just because that is the most obvious one that people can recognise. And with even a cursory examination, as I have just done in this video, it is very easy to make the argument that the modern day Conservative Party is awfully close to being in a similar category to what would otherwise be termed as a neo-Nazi party. Take away the anti-Semitism, take away a few other bits and pieces. In many other respects, there's a lot of similarity. And nobody should be comfortable with that argument having any validity in a modern day democracy. So let's swing back to the topic of racism more broadly. Now, I've said this before in this channel, but I will repeat it again because I believe it is important. When it comes to racism and any racist type scenarios, there are three categories of people in any given scenario. The first category is you are a champion or promoter or supporter of that racist viewpoint. So, you could be yelling, black people go home to where you come from, that sort of nonsense. So that is obviously a clear-cut category. You clearly support racism and that sort of stuff. And quite often people who fall into this category don't think of themselves as racist. But of course, if you look at it more objectively, you say, well, you support that viewpoint, you support that treatment of a minority, yes, you're racist. Okay. Second category are those who challenge or oppose or protest against any racist viewpoints. Now, you don't have to be, confrontational or big in anyone's face to fall into this category. A racist thing could happen, for example, to a work colleague, and you could feel too scared to challenge the boss about it. But you fall into this category if you make a complaint, or if after the event you go and support the victim of racism, offer them your support, condolences, whatever it may be. So there's a whole host of big and small things that people can do to challenge, confront, or just push back against racism. And now there's a third category, and those are the enablers. So, as the old saying goes, for evil to triumph, good people need only do nothing. And this is very much true of racism and other forms of discrimination. If you do nothing, you enable those who are the proponents, supporters of racism to go unchallenged, to have in their minds, validation for their viewpoints and the things that they do. What you'll see here is that there's no room for neutrality or impartiality, because there can't be. Unfortunately, this is one of the, it's not a black and white issue, it's not clear cut, but it is clearly obvious which categories any person or any scenario is in. Because you can't be neutral, because if you are neutral, then you're an enabler. It is that simple, and that unfortunately. And people may not want confrontation or challenge, but they have to understand that by doing absolutely nothing or by allowing the proponent to go unchallenged, that in itself is a form of support to those viewpoints. So talking back to the Gary Linekar type scenario, well, clearly the Conservative Party are the proponents of racism, spearheaded by the likes of Suella Braverman and Lee Anderson. Also clearly are some of the mainstream newspapers like the Daily Express or the Daily Mirror or the Sun, who support the Conservative Party in their racist language levied against asylum seekers and other minorities. So that's nice and clear and obvious. In the second category, we have Gary Linekar and other people. There's a whole host of other people as well, large and small, they fall into that category. In the third category, we have the BBC. And this is what the BBC need to understand in the context of this debate, is that Gary Linekar is challenging racism. Yes, he's drawn upon Nazism, 1930s Germany as part of that point. He talked about the statistical fact that the UK doesn't take its fair share of asylum seekers when compared to the rest of Europe and other nations. Those are all facts. But fundamentally, he is challenging racism. By slapping him down, by suspending him, the BBC, and under the guise of being impartial, the BBC are actually becoming enablers. Worse still, maybe a case can be made that they're in the first category, that they're actually supporting nationalism in the same way that those newspapers are. So this is what the BBC need to understand of why impartiality does not work in this context. You cannot be impartial when challenging racism. This is not just about freedom of speech. This is also about the fact that the modern day Conservative Party is an extremely racist in the way that they articulate themselves on the issue of asylum seekers. And I'm also going to widen the criticism a bit as well, because I'm going to point out that Keir Starmer and the front bench of the Labour Party are also in danger of being in this enabler category as well. Now, for normal people, members of the public, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't be so harsh or put a significant judgment on them. But the Labour Party are the future leaders. They're the future government of the UK. And so a higher bar has to be set for those in the leadership role. And that is true in any organisation. So if Keir Starmer is unable to properly challenge the Conservative racist narrative, then he himself is becoming an enabler of that narrative. And this is not an argument that Keir Starmer and the front bench of the Labour Party are racist, but this is an argument that they're pandering to racists because they want to win the red wall seats back. And in so doing, they are too afraid to very clearly call out Conservative policies and language as racist. In contrast, just to give a bit more, if you look at how the SNP frame themselves, particularly in Parliament, they clearly are calling out the Conservative language as racist. And in fact, various members of the SNP have even gone so far as to call the Conservative Party fascist in Parliament, using parliamentary privilege. So they are clearly in the same category as Gary Linekar. And for the avoidance of doubt in this video, I am with Gary Linekar on this one. So my final remarks about this whole Gary Linekar saga and this complete ridiculous mess that the BBC have put themselves into. I think there are wider things that we need to think about, which are not immediately obvious or not being immediately presented by the media. The media doesn't want to present these arguments. This is too awkward, too uncomfortable for them. But I think it is worth highlighting. The first is this is not just about free speech. So yes, it is impinging upon the right of Gary Linekar to have his own opinion and to freely express his opinion on a platform that is completely outside of his professional life. And that is a debate that the media are sort of highlighting, and the BBC is even vaguely acknowledged as being important. But that is far from the only issue. The BBC are going to be less happy about the fact that this is also throwing into question how they actually implement this concept of impartiality. And not just this Gary Linekar thing, but there's a whole host of criticism that can be levied against the BBC, that they have failed to do this properly. They failed to understand what impartiality truly means, and they failed to, and quite frankly, they're not implementing it. There are clearly issues there, and there's clearly a strong incentive for those at the top of the BBC not to address this issue properly. But this is going to be a very increasingly uncomfortable conversation for the rest of the media landscape in the UK. Because this is not just about free speech and impartiality, important issues as they are. This is also about racism. And whilst in this video I've talked about the racism of the Conservative Party, what I've not talked about, and which is equally valid, in that the mainstream media in the UK are strong proponents of racism and racist language. And they will want to dumb this down. They do not want to talk about this because this would cause challenges to them, to their business model. But this is going to be extremely uncomfortable for their political allegiance to the Conservative Party. Because if this conversation, this scandal about Gary Linekar actually moves on to racism, then very awkward questions are going to be asked by how the mainstream media covers these issues, especially that of asylum seekers. Even more awkward questions are going to be asked about the Conservative Party strategy of prosecuting a cultural war as a means of having some kind of platform to stand on going into the next general election. So if Linekar truly takes a stand, and if there becomes a true groundswell of support for his position, which seems to be starting up at this point in time, and we shall see what the future brings, then this becomes an almost existential threat to the Conservative Party, and to a lesser degree the newspapers that support them. Because then the conversation will turn to how racist they are, how awful their policies actually are, and how truly dreadful the language they employ in promoting those policies have been put forward, and that the way that people have been, in a sense, culturally brainwashed into looking at asylum seekers and to thinking that they have a reasonable view, when really what they are doing is either supporting or enabling racist viewpoints, racist policies and racist language. And none of that is acceptable. The UK has this value, has this belief in itself of being a decent, tolerant and caring society. And if they are not able to have a decent conversation challenging just how bad things have got in this space, and the issue of the asylum seekers is just a really obvious issue, there are others, then the UK citizens, UK voters are not going to be in a comfortable place. And the Conservative Party know that. They played with fire here, and I think Gary Linekar may well be the straw that broke the camel's back, or that will break them. That will cause them to be scorched by this sheer idiocy of what they have been doing. So I hope you found this video interesting and insightful. I felt this was a really interesting, really important topic. I find this whole Linekar scandal absolutely fascinating. and I think there are wider implications for this, and it's going to be really interesting to see where this goes next. So thank you very much for listening to this video. I hope you found it interesting. Please do subscribe if you want to see more of this content, and please do comment in the box below.